In this lecture, I want to show the importance of using a comma to eliminate confusion. Often the meaning of a sentence can change completely just by placing a comma at a different point in the sentence. So what do I mean by this? Well, a classic example of where a comma can change the meaning of a sentence is let's eat grandma versus let's eat grandma. The first one indicates that we're going to eat grandma as in cannibalism versus the second one which suggests to grandma that we should eat food. Two completely different meanings simply with a comma. Or for instance, I love baking my family and friends. It sounds to me that she loves putting her family and friends in the oven and baking them, which I'm sure is not the case. So to clarify this misunderstanding, we need to place a comma after the words baking and family. This will show that she loves baking, she loves her family, and she loves her friends, and not baking them. I hope now you understand the importance of correctly placing a comma and how a misplaced comma can lead to huge misunderstandings. So let's move on to the next lecture where we talk about how you can connect two sentences with a comma. Welcome to the first exercise of the course. It's one of many, and that's because I believe one of the best ways to learn is by practicing what I'm teaching. This is why throughout the class, I've set up several exercises that allow you to test your knowledge to make sure that you're on track and following along. If you at any point feel stuck, don't quite understand how to complete the assignment, please ask and I'll do my best to respond immediately. Now with that out of the way, in this first assignment, I'm going to be giving you a few sentences that are grammatically correct, but they have a misplaced, missing, or an extra comma, and you have to correct it. So for example, the sentence would be, the panda eats, shoots, and leaves. Here the extra comma needs to be removed because with it, it means the panda eats, shoots, and leaves. And that would be quite a scary panda. But I'm sure the writer just accidentally included an extra comma, which is why it should be the panda eats, shoots, and leaves. So try this assignment, and I've included all the assignment files in the first section of the course where you'll find not just the files for this exercise, but all future assignments. Commas are also great when you want to combine two standalone sentences that are somewhat related into one sentence with a comma. But before we do that, we need to define what a sentence is. Well, a sentence comprises two things, a subject and a predicate. A predicate is essentially something that's being said about the subject. These two things are all you need to make a complete sentence. So if I said, Jake and Andrew speak Spanish at home, the subject would be Jake and Andrew, while the predicate would be speak Spanish at home. Another example of this would be Jason prefers English, where the subject is Jason and the predicate is prefers English. Both of these are complete sentences, but if we wanted, we can combine them into one sentence. We could do this with a comma like this. Jake and Andrew speak Spanish at home, but Jason prefers English. You can see that we combined the two sentences simply by placing a comma after the word home and placing a conjunction between the two. Another great example of two related sentences being combined with a comma and a conjunction are Sam wanted to go to the museum and also the ticket prices were expensive. Now you can leave these as individual sentences because they both have their own subjects and predicates. But if we wanted, we can combine them and change it to Sam wanted to go to the museum, but the ticket prices were expensive. Both examples are not wrong as individual sentences, but it makes more sense to combine the two with a comma and a conjunction. Now I hope that clears things up, and in the next lecture we'll be talking about using commas to create parenthetical expressions that allow you to add additional information mid-sentence. Now let's talk about parenthetical expressions and how they can be used with commas to give the reader additional information. The reason for this is that often you want to add additional non-essential information within the text, but you want to do it in a way where it's concise and to the point. So for example, it says, Sarah hates hot weather. But let's say I also want to add to that ironically she comes from Iran, which is a hot climate country. How would I do that? Well, it's simple. I would write, Sarah, although she comes from Iran, hates the hot weather. Here, the additional information added was although she comes from Iran, and I specifically mentioned that between the two commas. The cool thing about it is that if we remove the information between the commas, it would still make sense. And that's the whole point of parenthetical expressions. It's adding additional information that, if removed, would still make sense. Now, parenthetical expressions aren't only applicable in mid-sentences. They can also be added to the beginning or the end of a sentence. So for example, it says, she likes football, as I later realized. Here we added the additional information, as I later realized, at the end of the sentence. But we could also switch it up to, as I later realized, she likes football. Now, the parenthetical expression is at the beginning of the sentence. Again, the key aspect of it is that if removed, the sentence should still make sense. I hope this helps, and in the following lecture, we'll be talking about using commas to make lists, which is by far the easiest and simplest way to use the comma. In this lecture, we'll be talking about making lists using commas, and as I mentioned earlier, this is by far the easiest use of the comma. The way it works is to list something like, I went to the grocery store to grab some milk, avocado, carrot, and cranberry juice. You would place a comma after every item except the last one, which is cranberry juice. It's that simple. Or is it? Well, there's a huge controversy on whether there should be a comma before the word and. There's a specific name for this comma, the Oxford comma. Some are totally against it, while others think it's mandatory. And both sides have their reasons. The ones that say we don't need it are against it because they claim that the meaning of the sentence is clear with or without the comma. So it just takes extra unnecessary space on the page. They also say that technically using a comma in a list is a replacement for the word and. So I went to the grocery store to grab some milk, avocado, carrot, and cranberry juice is basically short for I went to the grocery store to grab some milk and avocado and carrot and cranberry juice. So why would we need another comma when there's already the word and there? Which is understandable. But the ones that say we do need it claim that without the final comma there can be confusion. So for instance, if I said I love my parents, Jason and Emily, it might seem like the author is saying I love my parents who are Jason and Emily. And that's because of the missing comma. If we add the comma, it'll change to I love my parents, Jason, and Emily. Here it's much clearer that the parents aren't actually Jason and Emily, but maybe her friends. And if it weren't for the comma, we'd never know. But cases like these are rare, and usually you'd figure out the correct meaning based on context. So both sides have valid points, and it's up to you to decide which one's best and stick with it. As long as you're consistent, you can't go wrong either way. In this lecture, we'll be talking about colons and how you can use them to elaborate on a thought. Now, the purpose of the colon is to introduce additional information after an independent clause. So if I said a dolphin is not a fish, then that would be an independent clause. And we could follow that up with a colon and add to it by saying it's a warm-blooded mammal. Now you can see that the information before the colon is complete, but the information after it essentially elaborates on the first part of the sentence. Now that's the primary use for a colon. Something we can't do is write a dolphin is not a fish because, colon, it is a warm-blooded mammal. And that's because the information before the colon is not a complete sentence. I also want to add to that the information after the colon does not necessarily have to be a dependent clause, like in our first example. Both parts of the colon can be independent clauses, provided that they are related to one another. So for example, a dolphin is not a fish, colon, fish are cold-blooded mammals. You can see here that both statements are independent clauses that are related to one another, and the second part elaborates on the first. Although this is the primary use case for the colon, in the next lecture I'll be talking about another use that is just as useful. Like I mentioned, another great use for the colon is to create a list. This is similar to elaborating on a thought like in the last lecture, but here when you're elaborating, all you're really doing is listing items. For example, he was going to buy 3 things from the store, colon, chairs, tables, and a lamp. Here we have a colon being used to list items where the first half is an independent clause and the second is a dependent. Something you don't want to do is I have packed my cricket kit with the equipment I need, including colon, bats, balls, gloves, and pads. This is incorrect because the sentence before the colon is not considered a complete sentence. If we remove everything after the colon, it wouldn't make sense. So how do we fix this? Well, we change it to I've packed my cricket kit with the equipment I need, colon, bats, balls, gloves, and pads. Here, if we removed everything after the colon, it would still make sense. I hope these few examples gave you a better understanding of how to use the colon. It can be tricky sometimes, but with practice, you should be able to get the hang of it. Now let's move on to the semicolon. The best way to describe what a semicolon does is it's sort of a mix between a comma and a period. Semicolons are placed in a part of a sentence where you could place a period, but you want to let the reader know that the following sentence is related to the last one. For example, I went to the restaurant with my wife. I thought it was amazing. She thought it was terrible. These last two sentences are closely related, so instead of placing a period between them, we can connect them using a comma plus a conjunction. I thought it was amazing, but she thought it was terrible. That works, but it's not as concise as placing a semicolon. I thought it was amazing. She thought it was terrible. Instead of saying the exam went well, I got a 75 and my friend got a 93. We could change that to the exam went well, I got a 75, my friend got a 93. It's a very subtle difference and it's up to you to decide which one you like better. You may be wondering, what's the difference between a semicolon and a colon? Well, they may seem similar at first, but there's a subtle difference. The semicolon is used more to connect two complete sentences with similar thoughts, as I mentioned earlier, while the colon is used more to elaborate on the first part of the sentence. I don't want to go outside, colon, it's cold, wet, and windy. Here, the second part elaborates on the first rather than it being a standalone sentence. I hope that clears things up, and in the next lecture, we'll be talking about how you can use semicolons to make complex lists, making it easier to understand. As I mentioned, a semicolon is essentially a mix between a period and a comma. In the last lecture, we used a semicolon to replace a period, and in this lecture, we'll be talking about how you can use a semicolon as a replacement for commas to prevent confusion in your writing. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at this sentence for instance. The council comprises 10 members, 3 from Sydney, Australia, 4 from Auckland, New Zealand, 2 from Samoa, Fiji, and 1 from Honaria, Solomon Island. Grammatically speaking, there's nothing wrong with this sentence, but you may have noticed that there's tons of commas. A little too many if you ask me, and it can get confusing trying to identify which comma is for what purpose. So let me tell you, these commas are to separate city from country, while these are to separate number of council members from each city. This means there are two uses for the comma, and it might be difficult for someone to tell them apart. So in this case, we can continue to separate the cities and countries with commas, but separate the council member locations with a semicolon. Now, even if you were to quickly glance over the text, you can still visually separate the items on the list because of the semicolons. They essentially act as a stronger alternative to commas. The semicolon can act as a great alternative to using commas in a list or to connect two independent clauses, but they can't replace every use for the comma. For instance, we can't replace the comma that is placed between cities and countries. That would be incorrect. We also can't use semicolons for dates or numbers. That just looks a bit odd. And that's it. I hope this helps you get a better understanding of the semicolon and the few uses it has in writing. And I do want to say that using a semicolon is not a must like a comma or a period. You can get away with writing an entire novel without a semicolon, but it can occasionally be helpful. In the last few lectures, we talked about colons and semicolons, and you may have noticed that they're quite similar to one another in terms of functionality, so much so that many people often accidentally use them interchangeably. It can be confusing, which is why I explained the differences between the two and kept them as separate lessons. I want to make sure that you've understood the differences, which is why in this assignment, I'll be giving you a few sentences in which I want you to decide which is more appropriate and suitable for that specific sentence. But before I let you off, I'll be taking a question from the assignment and going over it here so you can get a better understanding of what is expected of you when answering the questions. The question is, which is most appropriate in the following sentence? There are several benefits of getting regular exercise, ? Better sleep, improves mood, and reduces blood pressure. Do we place a colon here or a semicolon? We know that semicolons connect two similar thoughts that aren't dependent on one another, and colons are used when you want to elaborate or answer the statement before the colon. And that's what's happening over here. The second part, better sleep, improves mood, and reduces blood pressure, basically elaborates on the first part, which is there are several benefits of getting regular exercise. I hope this helps you get a better understanding of the assignment, and good luck. Now we move on to the apostrophe. There are several uses for it, but in this lecture we'll be focusing on contractions. Contractions are when we combine two words into one, making it easier to speak with fewer syllables. For instance, the word I'm is short for I am, or the word won't is short for will not. The apostrophe is placed where the missing letters go, and although there is only one apostrophe, often it can count for many missing letters. Like the contraction she'd is short for she had or she would. In both cases, we have several missing letters. Let's look at some examples of contractions being used in complete sentences. He's not coming, his mother won't allow him, so I'll just go alone. Here there are several examples of contractions. He's is short for he is, won't is short for will not, and I'll is short for I will. You'll notice if we expand all the contractions from the sentence, it will still make sense. He is not coming, his mother will not allow him, so I will just go alone. The only difference is that you sound formal, and that's a key difference between contractions and using the complete form. If you're writing a college essay, then it's not recommended that you use contractions. But if you're having a regular conversation, it would be weird not to use them. That's just one of the more common ways to use the apostrophe. In the last lecture, we talked about using apostrophes for contractions, and in this lecture, we'll be discussing how you can use them to mark for possession. Possession is essentially when someone or something has, owns, or is a part of something else. So when I say that's Jacob's car, the word that's is a contraction for that is. But the word Jacobs is not necessarily a contraction, but to mark possession. A quick test to prove it would be to read it, assuming it is a contraction, and see if it makes sense. That is Jacobs is car. You can see it clearly doesn't make any sense, so we know that the apostrophe S is to mark possession in that Jacob owns the car. A couple of other examples of this would be the car's engine broke down. Here, although the car doesn't necessarily own the engine, it's still a part of the car, so we must add an apostrophe S. Now this is different from saying I have many cars without the apostrophe. This means there are multiple cars, meaning the S is to indicate plural rather than possession. It's a minute difference that many tend to overlook, so I want you to be aware of it. A couple more examples of using apostrophe for possession would be Larry's laptop stopped working. Here again, there aren't multiple Larrys, but instead it's to indicate that Larry owns the laptop. Or let's say my apartment's air conditioner stopped working. By now I'm sure that you know the apostrophe S refers to the fact that the air conditioner is a part of the apartment and not that there are several apartments. So it's important to know the differences between just adding an S to the end of a word versus adding an apostrophe, then the S, because this changes the meaning of a sentence. For the most part, this is simple, but it definitely gets confusing once we combine plurals with possessive terms, which is why the next lecture is dedicated to teaching you how to combine the two correctly. Hopefully by now you have a better understanding of using apostrophes for possession. Now let's move on to combining possessions and plural nouns. So let's say you're at the airport and you're admiring how massive all the planes are, specifically the size of their wings. And so you think, wow, the plane's wings are massive. How would you write the word planes? Is it planes with an apostrophe S? Is it planes with an S then an apostrophe? Or is it planes with an S and no apostrophe at all? Let me give you a second to think about it. If you guessed the planes with an S and then the apostrophe, then you'd be correct, because the S before the apostrophe is to indicate that there are multiple planes, and the apostrophe is for the S, which is to indicate that the wings are a part of the plane, but we drop it because it looks odd with that many S's. This applies to every plural that ends with an S. So I want to join the boys club. Again, there is an S before the apostrophe to indicate multiple boys, and the apostrophe plus the invisible S is to show the possession of the word club. Now I mentioned this applies to plurals that end with an S. What about plural nouns that don't end with an S? For example, women, children, teeth, or even feet. All these words are plural, yet they don't have any S's. In that case, if I were to say the men's change room is always packed, although the word men's is plural and possessive, I wouldn't drop the S after the apostrophe because the plural word men doesn't have an S. So there's no doubling of the letter, meaning there's no need to drop the possessive S. Now, this applies to all plural nouns that don't end with the letter S. Let's move on to periods. Periods are quite similar in that they're used to mark the endings of an imperative or a declarative sentence, among other things, all of which we'll discuss later in the class. What is an imperative sentence? Well, an imperative sentence is any command or request. So, grab my wallet from my room, don't forget to lock the house before you leave, or you've got to help me clean up around the house. These are just some examples of imperative sentences. Now, what about declarative? A declarative sentence is any sentence that declares a fact, observation, or a statement. So, the river looks dirty, it's quite cloudy today, or I love pizza. Now, declarative and imperative sentences are just different types of sentences. But what is a sentence? A sentence is a grammatically complete idea that contains a subject and a predicate, a subject being a noun or a pronoun, and a predicate being a verb or something being said about the subject. Let's take a look at one of the previous statements and break it down. The river looks dirty. Here, the river is the subject and looks dirty is the predicate. When we say looks dirty, it describes the subject, which is the river. Keep in mind that not all sentences explicitly mention the subject. Sometimes it can also be assumed. So if we take the imperative sentence, grab my wallet from my room, here the predicate is the entire sentence. Whereas the subject? A subject isn't directly stated, but rather it's implied. So in this sentence, the subject is you. You grab my wallet from my room, you being the person he's talking to. So that's all there is to know about periods to end sentences. But what about abbreviation? That's something I'll discuss in the following lecture, so I'll see you there. Let's talk about abbreviations. Abbreviations are used to shorten the length of a word. For example, DOB is short for date of birth, or app is short for application. This makes it easier to say or write commonly used words or phrases. There are 4 types of abbreviations, the first one being initialism. This is when you form an abbreviation using the first letters of a group of words. So if we wanted to abbreviate unidentified flying object, we would shorten it to UFO. Or for law enforcement agency like Federal Bureau of Investigation, we would shorten it to FBI and leave out the preposition words like of to keep the abbreviation short. This is also why it's USA for United States of America and not USOA. Another type of abbreviation is acronyms. These are similar to initialism in that we write the first letters of each word, but when we say acronyms, we don't say the first letters of each word like USA. Instead, we pronounce the letters like they were an actual word. For example, SIM is short for Subscriber Identification Module, but we don't say I need to get a SIM for my new number. We say it as a complete word, SIM. Another example of this would be the word RAM, which stands for Random Access Memory. We just call it RAM instead of RAM. The third type of abbreviation is contractions. This is when you remove letters from the middle of the word, and this type of abbreviation is often used to address someone. Words like doctor, Mr., or Miss can all be contracted to DR, MR, and MS. Notice how the first and last letters remain while the rest are removed. Now, it's not always necessary that we remove everything between the letters. It's just that we keep the first and last letter. For example, the word government can be shortened to GOVT. A quick note, depending on whether you follow American English or British English, we must place a period at the end of the contraction. British English tends to leave it out, while American English keeps it. And that takes us to my last type of abbreviation, which is to use abbreviations to shorten words, similar to contractions in that we remove letters. But in this, there's no set rules as to where you must remove the letters. It could be the middle of the word like contractions, or it could be the beginning or the end. Another difference is that once we shorten the word, the condensed version itself becomes the word. For example, the word influenza can be shortened to flu, and you'll rarely hear people saying influenza. Instead, you'll just hear them say the word flu. Take the word app, for instance. That's short for application, and we've essentially removed the entire second half of the word. Also, you don't need to place a period after the shortened word. And there you have it. That's about all you need to know about abbreviations. It's an important topic that many overlook, which is why I've created an entire lecture on it. In the following lecture, I'll be teaching you how to use ellipses correctly. See you there. In this lecture, we'll be talking about ellipses because although ellipses rarely get used in writing, they can definitely come handy from time to time. The ellipses can be used for many things. One of them is to show that we remove something from speech when quoting others. So if someone were to say, after school, I went to my friend's house to work on a group assignment, which was extremely difficult, and then we went to the park. Here, if we wanted to quote this person but felt that we could remove extra unnecessary information from the speech, we could do this with the help of the ellipses. So the quote would change to, after school, I went to my friend's house to work on a group assignment, ellipses, and then we went to the park. Here, we place the ellipses on the part of the speech that was removed, and we do this so it's clear to the reader that we've left out some parts of the speech. Another great way to use the ellipses is to indicate that there is a pause in speech. And this pause could be for many reasons. It could be to create suspense, show a losing train of thought, or debating whether or not they should say what they're about to say. I mean, the reasons are endless. So a quick example one would be, and the winner for the 2023 spelling competition is Amber Gray. Here, the ellipses was used to create suspense for the crowd before announcing the winner of the competition. Another example would be, Jason, can you go to the supermarket to grab chili, pepper, and garlic? Don't forget about the garlic. Here, the ellipses is used to create a pause where the speaker was trying to remember what the last item on her list was. Again, the uses for the ellipses are endless, but at the end of the day, they're used to give the reader the feeling of actually being there. Because we're not always using words to pass on information, but rather the lack of them, and the ellipses can help portray that. Now we move on to the dash, and this symbol is quite unique in that it can be used to replace quite a few punctuation marks, whether it be commas, brackets, or even colons. Although it can't be used everywhere these punctuation marks are used, there's still quite a few examples where they are interchangeable. Let's take commas for instance. Here it says, I went skiing, comma, with my brother, comma, in Alberta. The information between the commas with my brother is additional information that can be removed and it wouldn't change the meaning of the sentence. We can replace the commas with dashes and that would also be grammatically correct. So it would change to I went skiing, dash, with my brother, dash, in Alberta. Let's try another example, but with colons. Making banana smoothies is quite simple. All you need are 3 ingredients: milk, banana, and yogurt. This works, but we can also replace the colon with a dash. So making banana smoothies is quite simple. All you need are 3 ingredients, dash, milk, banana, and yogurt. Both examples are fine, and it's up to you to decide which you prefer. Finally, dashes can also be used as replacements for brackets, because brackets are often used to elaborate on a specific point where a reader might be confused. For example, Johnny MacDonald, the first Canadian Prime Minister, served his final year in office in 1891. The information between the brackets is one that many of the readers may already know, but it's there in case someone doesn't. That's why I can get away with it by placing it in a bracket. But if not, and you feel that this is crucial information, then you may want to change it to a dash. This will indicate a stronger emphasis on the importance of the information. And that's about it for dashes. I recommend you try using dashes in your next piece of writing as they can add sort of an elegance to your writing. Hyphens are an essential aspect of punctuation because without them, it can cause a lot of confusion and ambiguity. And a change in hyphenation can completely change the meaning of a sentence. What do I mean by that? Well, a simple statement like, I have 24-hour shifts can have 3 different meanings just by moving the position of the hyphen. If I were to place a hyphen between the words for and hour, then that would mean that I have 24-hour shifts. But if I move the hyphen and place it between the words 20 and 4, then that would mean I have 24 1-hour shifts. So 24 of them. What if I place a hyphen between both places? Now I have 24-hour shifts, as in they last 24 hours, and it doesn't specify how many of them. I just know that it's more than one because there is an S at the end of the word shift. You can see just a simple change in placement of the hyphen can completely change the length and number of shifts. It's no wonder I used to always miss my shifts. But jokes aside, this can cause a lot of confusion, not just in this, but in many other cases as well. Which is why in the next lecture, I'll be covering some of the rules that you need to be aware of when using hyphens. Hyphens can also be used between two words that are combined to be used as a single adjective to describe a noun. For example, it's impossible to eat this rock hard pizza. Here, the words rock hard are compound adjectives describing the noun pizza. So we must hyphenate all compound modifiers that come before a noun. And I specifically say before a noun because if it comes after, then you no longer need a hyphen. So if I were to change it to the pizza is rock hard, I would no longer need the hyphen. A few more examples of this would be, I met the well-known actor Will Smith. Brad Pitt is a well-known actor. My parents gifted me this brand new car. My car is brand new. In all of these examples, you can see that when the compound modifier comes before the noun, there is a hyphen, and when it comes after, then you no longer need a hyphen. A quick bonus tip is that you also need to place hyphens between compound numbers. So basically all numbers between 21 and 99, except for 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, and 90, because they're not compounds. So if I were to write 29, then you would need to place a hyphen between the words 20 and 9. Or let's say you want to write out 45, you would also do it like this with a hyphen between the words 40 and 5. Now, if you have a number that's greater than 100, then you will also place a hyphen in the numbers that are between 21 and 99. So for example, 378. Notice how we don't place a hyphen between the 300, but we do so between the numbers 70 and 8, even though the number as a whole is above 99. This also applies to when you're using them in a sentence. So I have $39 to spend at the carnival, or it took me 69 days to renovate the house. In both cases, we must place a hyphen in between the numbers. In this lecture, we'll be talking about prefixes and suffixes and how you can use them in combination with hyphens, because not all prefixes or suffixes require a hyphen. Let's start with prefixes. What are they? Prefixes are letters added to the beginning of the word that modify its meaning. For example, here with unlock, the original word is lock and the prefix is on, which means the opposite or to reverse something. So unlock means the opposite of lock. Not all prefixes are combined into one word. Some may be separated with a hyphen. For example, recover, which means to cover something again. We add a hyphen here because without it, the meaning would completely change. Removing the hyphen could change it to recover, which means to return to an original stage or regain access to something that was lost. Another example would be recreation, which means to do something for fun or enjoyment, like his only form of recreation is football. Now, if we were to add a hyphen, it would change from recreation to recreation. And recreation means to create something again, which is totally different from doing something for enjoyment. A basic rule of thumb is that if it changes the meaning, then we must add or remove the hyphen accordingly. If not, we just remove it. What about suffixes? Suffixes work the exact same way as prefixes, but the only difference is that instead of letters being added at the beginning of the word, we add them at the end. So words like worldwide, childlike, or even province-wide. With suffixes, generally speaking, there isn't a hyphen because they don't change much regardless of whether or not we add the hyphen. So we just remove it. But that comes with time. It starts off as two words, then the hyphen gets added, and over time, if we continue to use these two words in combination, it just turns into province-wide. But not all suffixes start off as two words or ever get a hyphen. So words like sadness, treatment, jealousy, or taxable include suffixes. And at no point were they separated or had a hyphen between them. I mentioned in an earlier lecture that sometimes it can be confusing to determine whether a compound word should be hyphenated, and I explained some of the ways to identify whether or not it should be hyphenated. One of the methods was to check to see if the meaning of the word changes, and if it does, then you should hyphenate it accordingly. If not, then you can just leave it out. In this assignment, I want you to do exactly that. I'll be giving you a sentence, and in it, I need you to place a hyphen correctly. For example, the first sentence is, I work at a family-owned cafe. Here, we need to determine where we should place a hyphen or multiple hyphens. Well, the answer is that we should place a hyphen between the words family and owned, because the compound modifier comes before the noun cafe. Hopefully this helps you get a better understanding of what to expect in the assignment. So good luck. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Let's talk about the exclamation mark. The exclamation mark is used primarily to convey strong emotion, whether that be positive or negative. For example, I can't believe I passed the exam. Here, the emotion is a mix of excitement and shock at the fact that the person passed the exam. If you took the same sentence and removed the exclamation mark, it would change to, I can't believe I passed the exam. With this in mind, it's hard to tell whether the person is actually excited about passing the exam. This can also be used to convey a negative emotion. I hate this job. Here, the emotion is anger with a bit of frustration, and this is shown with the exclamation mark. You could also get a similar meaning across without the exclamation mark. I hate this job. This delivers the exact same message but doesn't necessarily convey a strong emotion, just a fact. Exclamation marks can also be used to emphasize a specific word, and this is done with the help of a bracket. They charged me $87 in late fees. Here, the writer wanted to place an emphasis on the $87, and that's because he thinks that $87 is a lot for late fees. He did this by placing an exclamation mark between the brackets right after the dollar amount. Something to keep in mind is that whenever you use an exclamation mark, it replaces a period. So you don't need to place both in one sentence. So if I were to say, I finally got hired, which is a complete sentence, I don't need to place a period after the sentence ends because the exclamation mark acts as a period. With all that being said, although the exclamation mark can be quite handy, especially when you want to convey a strong emotion, it is recommended that you keep it to a minimum, especially when it comes to formal writing, because the overuse of the exclamation mark reduces the effectiveness of each one, so be mindful of that. In this lecture, we'll talk about using quotation marks, and more specifically, using quotation marks for direct speech. For example, he said, I don't like playing outside. Here we're quoting what someone else said word for word, and we indicate this by putting quotation marks at the beginning and end of his speech. I'm sick and tired of this job, she yelled at the top of her lungs. Here again, we're using quotation marks to show the exact words she used to express herself. We don't always have to quote an entire sentence if we don't want to. For example, if we feel that there are parts of the quote that don't add value to what is being said, we can eliminate it with the help of the ellipses. Let's say the complete quote is, my brother, who is 10, loves playing outside, and I want to quote this person, but I feel that it's too long and contains unnecessary information. I can simply change it to, my brother, ellipses, loves playing outside. This way, you're condensing the information while still being honest as to where you remove the information from. Now let me put your knowledge to the test. Where would you place the quotation marks in the following sentence? I really don't like playing soccer, she said. Where would you place the quotation marks? I'll give you a second to pause the video and think about it. If you chose to put one question mark at the beginning and one right after the word soccer, then you'd be correct. I really don't like playing soccer, she said. Now let's try one that's a bit more difficult. He called them loud, messy, and disrespectful, and then he left to go for a smoke. Where do you think we should place the quotation mark? Please pause the video until you feel that you have the correct answer. If you picked one right before the word loud and the other one after disrespectful, then you'd be correct. Hopefully this gives you a better understanding of the correct ways to use direct quotation marks. And in the next lecture, we'll move on to using quotation marks for indirect speech. Now that we've learned a bit about quotation marks, let's test your knowledge. In this assignment, I'll be giving you a few sentences, and I want you to identify where you need to put the quotations within the sentence. It starts off quite easy and simple, where there's only one quote, but there are a few examples where there might be a quote within a quote, and it's your job to identify where to place them correctly, where to use double quotes, and where you might need single quotes. As always, I like to give you a few examples before you rush into the assignment and do it for yourself. The first question that you'll see on the assignment is place quotation marks accordingly in the next few sentences. The first sentence is, "Why do you always fight?" Alex asked them. "I'm sick and tired of it." Where do we place the quotation mark? We know the quote should be around what Alex said. So it starts with, "Why do you always fight?" Alex asked them. We know that we should place quotation marks around "Why do you always fight?" Then it goes on to say, "I'm sick and tired of it." We can assume that it is also what Alex said since there's no other speaker mentioned. And that's it. It's quite simple. And now it's your turn to go ahead and open up the assignment and begin quoting. And good luck. Quotations are not just limited to quoting direct word-for-word speech. They can also be used indirectly. For example, "My brother's quick trip to the grocery store caused me to miss soccer practice." In this way, we put single quotation marks around the word quick to indicate that there was nothing quick about it, and in fact, he took longer than expected. Another example of this would be, "The service on first class was horrible." Here, we put quotation marks around the word first class to let the readers know that it didn't seem like first class, because first class is often portrayed as luxurious with exceptional service, but that's not how they felt when they boarded, which may be a bit ironic. Another example of using quotation marks indirectly is when you're referring to words as actual words and not their meaning. So let me give you an example. The word date can be used in many different ways. Here, we're not actually using the word date in meaning, but rather just referring to it. We do this by placing quotation marks around the word. One more example would be, "What does it mean to be biased?" Here, we're not using the word with its meaning, but rather we're just referring to the word. I hope this is easy to understand, and I know it can be a bit complex, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Now let's talk about the two different types of quotes, single and double. You're probably more familiar with the latter because it's more commonly used, but they both essentially do the same thing, which is quote others. If you wanted to say, "She said I don't like winter," you could write it either with single quotes like this or double quotes like this. It's up to you and your style guide, because some style guides place restrictions on which ones you're supposed to use. But at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. But where it does matter is when you have a quote within a quote. This is to make things easier to understand. For example, "Sam told me, Jason said there's no point in trying," which is absurd. When it starts with "Sam told me," there's a quotation mark, then it's "Jason said," then there's another quotation mark followed by "there's no point in trying" with yet another quotation mark, and then it says "which is absurd," which ends with a final quotation marks. Now this can get confusing very quickly, like the words "Jason said" are in between two quote marks. So does that mean that that's a complete quote? Well, the answer is no, but how do we let the reader know this? Well, we let them know this by using two different types of quotes. So for the first one, we can use the regular double quotes, and for the second one, we'll switch it over to single quotes. And this makes it much easier to identify which quote starts and ends where. Now it's up to you to decide which one is single quote and which one is double. Now we'll be moving on to the question mark. Question marks are quite easy to understand. You simply add them at the end of a question. So, when is the next assignment due? When can we afford a house? What time do we meet up? Keep in mind that this doesn't apply to when there's a question within a statement. In other words, when the statement presents a question instead of asking a question. What do I mean by this? For instance, she asked me if she needed to dress formally for work. The question is, does she need to dress formally for work? But the person making the statement is not the one asking, but rather paraphrasing her. So in this case, we don't need to place a question mark. Another place where it may be a bit confusing as to where you may need to place a question mark is when it comes to quotations. If I were to say, participants were asked, "How often do you exercise per week?" Where would I place a question mark? Would it be on the outside of the quotation mark or inside? If you guess inside, then you'd be correct because the question is inside the quote. How often do you exercise per week? What if I were to say, did she really say "I hate working here"? The question starts on the outside of the quote, and whatever is inside the quotation mark is a part of the question, which is why we should place a question mark on the outside of the quotation marks. Let's move on to a trickier example and see if you can figure it out. What should I say when she asks, "Where have you been all night?" Do I place a question mark on the inside of the quote or the outside? Or do you place one in both the outside and the inside? Pause the video until you think you have the answer. And the answer is you drop the second question mark, the one that's on the outside of the quotation mark. If there are two direct questions, then the first one that's on the outside of the quote becomes a statement, and we don't need a question mark for it. And that about covers it for question marks. There's not much else you need to know. They're quite simple and to the point. In this lecture, I want to talk about using parentheses, or what some may call brackets. Either one is correct, but what about the correct methods of using them? Parentheses are mainly used to add extra information to text, similar to the way we can use commas and dashes. The difference is that commas and dashes require you to keep the information quite relevant to what is being said. This same limitation does not apply to the parentheses. Although it does have to be somewhat relevant, it's not to the same extent as a comma or a dash. So what types of information can be included? Well, you can use them for years, dates, citations, creating a list, and even to clarify or elaborate on something. For example, she, Jessica, loves to go on adventures. The name Jessica was never part of the original sentence, but it was added for clarification for the reader because we may not know who they're referring to when they say she. Another example of where it can be used to clarify something would be Jason, Emily's husband, works at a coffee shop. Here we're using brackets to introduce a new character to the scene because if Jason was being mentioned for the first time, we may not know who he is or why he's being mentioned. We can also use brackets to elaborate on something. For example, all workers, who are now gaining attention, protest for higher wages. The workers protesting is important information, but the fact that they're gaining attention is great to know. Removing it doesn't take much away from the main point, and the sentence still makes sense without it. All workers protest for higher wages. Parentheses are also great for adding time periods. For example, if we're talking about the Great Depression, we can say the Great Depression, 1929 to 1939, was the worst economic downturn in the industrialized world. Here, we've included the years in which the Great Depression took place, and it makes it concise and to the point. Otherwise, we would have to write the Great Depression, which lasted from 1929 to 1939, was the worst economic downturn in the industrialized world. Now, this can also apply to birth and death years. For example, Albert Einstein, 1870 to 1955, is best known for developing the theory of relativity. Again, we're using brackets to place additional information. Parentheses can also be used to let your reader know that they can choose how they would like to interpret the information. For example, write the participant's name, S. By adding the S in parentheses, this means that you could just have one name or multiple names. It's up to you. These are just some of the most common uses for the parentheses, and there are many more ways that you may come across. But by now, you should have a solid understanding of what parentheses are and how they can be used. And in the next lecture, we'll be talking about squared brackets, which look quite similar to the parentheses, but serve very different purposes. In this lecture, I'll be talking about how to use square brackets, because many people confuse them with the parentheses and use them interchangeably, but that's simply not correct. One of the most common uses for the square brackets is using the sic. You may have seen this in the past, but may not be sure what exactly it means or what it does. Let's start with the former. Sic comes from the Latin word which is sic id ex scriptum, which translates to thus it was written. It's used in text when an author is quoting someone for verbatim and there happens to be a mistake in the text, and the author could correct it, whether it be a spelling mistake, mixing between homonyms, or even a punctuation error. But that would be disingenuous. The author lets the reader know that's exactly what was written in the original text by placing a sic right next to it. For example, if the original text was, I can't come, it's Friday, there's a missing apostrophe in the word it's. We simply place a sic right next to the word, letting the reader know that it's a mistake made by the original writer and not the author. Another way to use the square brackets is by adding additional information to the text. This one is quite similar to the use case for the parentheses. For example, with parentheses, if the writer was referring to a character that the reader may not know, the writer can do something like this. John, plumber, hates working on older homes. We're letting the reader know that John is the plumber. But when it comes to square brackets, we add them when we're quoting others, and the information within the brackets was never part of the original speech. For example, she told me I hate it. Square bracket, work, square bracket. It absolutely drains me. The word work was never part of the original speech, but was rather later added by the author. It's a slight difference, but one that you may want to take a note of. That's it for square brackets. They're not as commonly used, especially when compared to the parentheses, which you'll see all over the place. Well, what did you think? Did you enjoy this class? I hope that by now you're familiar with all the different types of punctuation marks and that you know how to use them correctly. If you have things that you want to learn more about when it comes to punctuation, please feel free to let me know. Punctuation can get complicated, and to this day, I'm still learning because punctuation rules are changing and evolving all the time. If there's anything you feel was missing in this course, please let me know. And if you haven't left a review for this class, I do appreciate all your reviews. And if you're interested in taking your skills to the next level, I have tons of other courses that can help you become a better editor, proofreader, typer, and so much more. You can check them out in my instructor's profile. And thank you so much, and I wish you the best.